Hey guys, so we're at the Botany Greenhouses right now off Riverbend, and we're going to kind of give you a virtual tour here today. So right now we are in the tropical room, kind of the first room you come to when you first walk in the building. This isn't the front door, there's a bit of a area out here. And as you can see here, there's all these plants growing along the walls. You see this Spanish moss, which you might see growing in Florida, South Carolina, or the coast of Georgia. All these plants are epiphytes. That means that these are all plants that naturally grow on something else as opposed to growing in soil. They're non-terrestrial plants. They grow in the canopies of other plants. So if you ever hear about that statistic about some tropical trees are able to house like hundreds of plants in their canopies, this is an example of how you're able to do that. A lot of these here are orchids. You see this pink one blooming down here. This is a moth orchid like you see at grocery stores. They're a really common one, probably a lot of them around offices at UGA. There's another really cool blooming orchid right over here we can show you. Some of these are ferns. A lot of these here are ferns as well. And some of these, like the Spanish moss, is a bromeliad, which is in the pineapple family. And a lot of these around here are also in the bromeliad family, Bromeliaceae. Which the pineapple, like I said, is a fruit that you eat out of that family, which is kind of cool. It's closely related to Spanish moss. And just to give you an example of some fun scientific names, I think Spanish moss is a really crazy scientific name. It is Tillandsia usneoides, which I just always thought was a really fun, crazy scientific name. Look it up, it's still really wild. But anyways, there's this really cool orchid here that really has some wild frilly flowers, and we're gonna go into a lot of detail about orchids later in the semester. But these are all epiphytes that grow on the canopies or on other trees or other structures, so that's one thing I want to introduce you guys to.
All right, everybody, speaking of epiphytes, here we have a wall of Nepenthes. These are carnivorous plants that often grows epiphytes in the tropical forests of places like Malaysia, Borneo, even Australia. And what's really cool about these carnivorous plants is they have these huge pitchers. And these pitchers in particular are really unique. A lot of them are, actually all Nepenthes, or tropical pitcher plants, are endangered and in their native habitats, so a lot of these are hybrids rather than the natural species. However, we do have the natural species Nepenthes truncata right here, which has these huge truncate leaves. You'll learn that term later on this semester. And they have these huge foot and a half tall pitchers. Now what's really cool about these is these are actually extended midveins that have evolved to grow out, and then they slowly inflate as long as they have enough nutrients, water, light, etc. And the midvein inflates. So this is what it looks like when it first starts forming. And then it slowly inflates until eventually it reaches its maximum size, and this lid, which is normally folded down when it's forming, pops up and open, and the pitcher fills not with water, but with its own digestive fluids. So what we're gonna do now is show you what that digestive fluid looks like before, and then we're gonna actually dump it out and show you all the crazy stuff that this thing has caught just here in the greenhouse. So as we take a look into the Nepenthes truncata pitcher here, you can see that there's all sorts of stuff moving. A little bit of that is because of me moving the pitcher, but there's actually all sorts of really crazy bacteria and microorganisms living inside these pitchers. In some species, you even get commensal bats that live inside the pitchers and roost in there at night, and then they feed the pitchers with the guano. So now what we're going to do is dump this out on the ground and show you what all this one has caught. So as you can see, this pitcher has caught literally hundreds, if not thousands, of ants. So, we've already talked about these pitchers here, the Nepenthes. We've got some really cool, pretty ones here, and we'll probably put a few still shots in between just to show you the crazy diversity of this genus. So, speaking of other pitcher plants, here we have Sarracenia. Unfortunately, they're dormant right now. These are native to the southeastern United States, going north up the east coast and into Canada even. Specifically, this species here, Sarracenia purpurea, is native to all the way to Canada. What's really cool about these is these are also modified leaves. These modified leaves act as traps And these are completely passive, just like the Nepenthes. They don't move or anything. And essentially, within each of these traps, you can find another liquid digestive fluid that allows these plants to capture and digest insects. Okay, so now that we've covered Sarracenia and Nepenthes, we're going to cover some other carnivorous plants called sundews and butterworts. Sundews are in the genus Drosera or Drosera, depends on who you ask, and those are these guys right here. We have sundews, actually sundews are native to every continent of the world except Antarctica. And here we have butterworts, also known as pinguicula, and pinguicula are also pretty widespread, but they're primarily in North America and South America, but there are a few species in, I believe, Europe. And so what's really cool about all carnivorous plants, though, is the way that they develop these carnivorous traits. And the way they develop that carnivory is because they grow in habitats with low nitrogen availability in the soil. So they develop these carnivorous ways in order to access nitrogen through carnivory. Sundews in particular have these reddish trichomes that are extending from the leaf blade. These trichomes have small drops of dew on the end. It's not really dew though, it's actually mucilage that the plants produce, and it contains digestive enzymes. This one has caught a fungus gnat. Once they've caught a bug, the trichomes will slowly encase that bug in mucilage by moving closer to it. So this is the first of the carnivorous plants that we're going to talk about that actually is capable of movement. Butterworts essentially do the same thing as sundews. However, you can see that their leaves, I like to call this carnivorous lettuce personally. They catch all sorts of crazy little fungus gnats and whatnot. You can see those little hairs, they're really tiny with the mucilage on them. Butterworts are also known for having very pretty flowers. This one in particular is Pinguicula gigantea, which comes from Mexico, and it gets quite large, as you can see. The last carnivorous plant on our tour today is the Venus flytrap, also known as Dionea muscipula. Venus flytraps are one of the most famous of carnivorous plants. In fact, I'm pretty sure most of you have probably heard of them before, if not seen them, especially in the little death cubes at Lowe's. So they're one of the fastest plants in the world, meaning they move at a pace that is actually visible to the human eye. And that is accomplished through solute movement between the membranes within each of the traps. So as you can see here, in the trap there are 3 small trigger hairs. These small trigger hairs, when hit in quick succession, will trigger the trap to close. Perfect. So, that's pretty cool, right? And pretty fast. Just like the rest of the carnivorous plants that we've talked about so far today, and I lied, this is actually not going to be our last one, but Venus flytraps are also modified leaves.
So we just touched on the Venus flytrap that moves rather quickly in order to move quick enough to actually catch an animal. Here's another plant that moves on a similar time scale as the Venus flytrap. So this is a mimosa, and if you brush the leaves, you can see they clamp up. And that's often thought of as a way to sort of discourage herbivory. But Mason sort of touched on it earlier. I really kind of want you guys to think for a minute and consider how some plants are able to move at a time scale almost as if they had muscles. And I think Mason touched on it, like I said, it's largely by solute movement and manipulating the hydraulic conductivity. You can almost think of it as like inflating a balloon to move something in one direction. But that's the way that plants are able to manipulate water, manipulate solutes within their tissues to make a rapid movement like you see with this plant and with the Venus flytrap. So some other plants we want to touch on today. We mentioned the pitcher plants already, and these are plants, like Mason mentioned, grow in low nutrient environments. They're often swamps. So swamps, of course, have a lot of water. There are some plants that are floating plants. Come over here. So down here we have this plant, which is called Azolla. This is actually a floating fern. We'll go into a little more detail about it later in the semester. We're actually going to spend some time looking at that. But again, that's a floating fern, which I think is really cool. Another floating plant we have down here, and this is actually I think it's a really amazing plant. You see how tiny it is? Each one of those is an entire individual plant. This plant has a common name, duckweed. Again, this is a plant we'll talk about later in the semester, but you can see how tiny they are. So these are a flowering plant. Unlike the fern, these are actually a flowering plant. They're the smallest flowering plant in the world, and under the right conditions, what you see here can literally double in size in a day under the proper, really good water conditions and good light conditions. So this is a plant that can actually be used to create quite a bit of biomass in certain situations for feed. So just to mention again, this plant has the common name duckweed. It's in the genus Limina. And as I mentioned, it grows really, really fast, so fast, it's incredibly prolific. It can literally cover a pond or a body of water in just a very short amount of time. And if you see an area that's really, really densely covered with this, kind of like what you see in some spots of it, it can actually look practically like a meadow because it can grow so dense under the right conditions. So in addition to the azolla and the duckweed that we've already seen, here in this pot, we have another aquatic plant called Utricularia. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it has little itty bitty tiny little almost like bubbles that suck up copepods and small microscopic organisms that live in the water very rapidly. So this is another carnivorous plant and an aquatic plant. This is a flowering plant, for example, and this plant actually has the smallest genome of any known organism currently. So as we've already seen a few of today, we have some flowers. We've seen the orchids. I don't know if we pointed out, but the nepenthes have flowers on them as well. So insects pollinating flowers is one very common plant-insect relationship that you see all the time. As we saw with the carnivorous plants, that's another plant-insect relationship. A third plant-insect relationship that you may not have heard of is a group of plants called Myrmecophytes. Here's a good example of one. It's in the genus Myrmecodia. So this is a plant that houses ants. And it has these little holes right here that the ants can go inside of the hollow stem. And this plant also has thorns on it, which makes for a good defense and a good house for the plant, for the ants. And then the ants can sort of function as a defensive mechanism for the plant. So again, just to reiterate, here's a Myrmecophyte, a plant that houses ants in its stem. And its stem is hollow and it has thorns, so it's specifically adapted for this strategy. So like I just said, we were looking at a Myrmecophyte that houses the ants in the stems. Another one would be right here, Dischidia, which houses the ants in the scalloped sort of kidney-shaped leaves. Here, they sort of fold over on each other and kind of make a little protective housing structure for the ants to home in. So the first one we saw was an example of a Myrmecophyte that houses ants in the stem, whereas this one houses ants in the leaves. So the Dischidia that I just mentioned houses the ants in the leaves. Over here we have a fern, which is a non-flowering plant. Those other two ones we mentioned were angiosperms. Those are flowering plants. This is a non-flowering plant, a fern, and this actually houses the ants in the rhizomes, those thick fleshy rhizomes you see there. So this is another Myrmecophyte that houses ants inside of the rhizome, which is a different structure than the other ones we've seen already. One last thing I want to mention about this room. You might have seen these colorful plants as Mason was going around and kind of doing that wide sweeping shot of the whole room. So this right here, all of these varied leaves of these three plants, these are all actually the same species. They have been bred with all this variation by horticulturalists that want to make really dynamic and vibrant looking plants for ornamental purposes. I just want to use this to illustrate a point of how varied plants within an individual species can be. But with the skills you learn in this class about taxonomy, dissection, and how to identify plants, you'll be able to recognize how these plants are actually the same species. So that was everything we wanted to show you in this room, the first room. If you have any questions on anything you saw, please let us know. There's all sorts of cool things in here that we didn't touch on. I just want to point out again, all of these here, not this fern of course, not this Dischidia, but all these here are orchids, like we saw at the beginning. We have some flower spikes coming up, here's some blooms, and these silvery plants in the back, those are some orchids as well. But these silvery plants back here are more bromeliads, which, to reiterate, that was the pineapple family, and there's a flower spike coming up there as well. So these are all flowering plants, of course. Next, we're going to go into what's sometimes called the primitive plant room. or the room that contains early divergent plants like ferns, tree ferns, gymnosperms. Really cool room. So here we are in the dinosaur room, or the primitive room, whatever you want to call it. Not everything in here is a non-flowering plant, but a lot of the things in here are a fern, or like we have here, a cycad, which is a type of gymnosperm, a non-flowering plant. Over here, this is a equisetum, has a common name, horsetail fern. This is a fern ally, another non-flowering plant. We'll look at that later in the semester, a little more close up. And over here we have a flowering plant that's in this room. This is a Cyperus papyrus. This is a great ornamental plant. You can see it in gardens and ponds all the time. But this is actually a really cool historic plant. This is the plant the ancient Egyptians actually used to create the first papyrus, you know, the first sort of primitive paper. So this is kind of a neat historic plant. Also makes for a fun sort of fireworky plant in the landscape. So also in this room there's a ton of ferns, a lot of diversity in ferns, which are also non-flowering plants. I pointed this guy out here a second ago. I said it was a cycad. Looking at it closer, I realized it's not a cycad, it's Podocarpus. That is still a type of gymnosperm though, a non-flowering plant. Here is another different species of Podocarpus, another gymnosperm. And you can actually see the fleshy cones that you may mistake for fruit, but you'll learn all about those, about how they're actually typically cones. But then as we make our way down this walkway, you can see there's a huge diversity of ferns here. We have a lot of different types of ferns, including this Xylodon, the whisk fern. This is one we'll spend some time looking at closer later in the semester. You can see the little yellow sporangia there. And if you look at this fern leaf here, you can see the sporangia, which again, we'll spend a ton of time looking at this up close later in the semester. I just want to give you guys a taste of what to look forward to. But here you can see all sorts of diversity in ferns. We have some more different types of ferns here, different types of sporangia. So there's quite a bit of diversity in this greenhouse. Here's a fern, and this is a fern I think is really cool. It's called a staghorn fern. They grow these big, massive bunches. So these kind of leafy fronds that you see here, these are the fertile fronds. Here you can see the brown sporangia on it. And this is not the best example, but they also have what are called shield fronds. And that's this back here. It grows sort of flat. And they actually will create sort of a giant ball. These grow as an epiphyte. So as we saw in the previous row, these grow in a canopy of a plant. And they use these shield fronds to sort of almost create their own pot that'll collect detritus to sort of give themselves a reservoir for nutrients and water and moisture. And then they have these sort of, like I said, leafy fronds here that are used for reproduction and to capture a lot of light, chlorophyll.
So continuing our tour, we're going to talk about some cycads. Cycads are really neat. They're actually one of the most potent plants in the world alongside carnivorous plants and orchids. But what's really cool about them is we called this the primitive room earlier, right? So and primitive should be in quotes. These plants are no more primitive than anything we've shown you today. They've had just as long to evolve. So the reason we call them primitive or dinosaur plants, right, is because these are the kinds of plants you might see back when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. You can picture a stegosaurus or a brontosaurus biting through these thick, fleshy leaves and being very difficult to digest for most things. We're going to go ahead and keep walking on, and you can see all sorts of really cool plants, cycads, ferns everywhere. This is one of my favorite rooms just because it's such a lush, jungle-like environment. This staghorn fern here, you can see some really good examples of the shield fronds that Mark was talking about a few minutes ago. But moving on from there, we have one of my favorite plants in this room. It doesn't look like much. It's not super happy right now because it's a little colder than it would like being winter. But this is a Gnetum. It's spelled G-N-E-T-U-M. Gnetum is actually not a flowering plant. It is a gymnosperm. So it produces cones, just like a pine tree or a fir or a spruce. But it's broad-leaved like you would expect in an angiosperm. And that's just one of the really cool things about it. So here I'm showing you the reproductive structures of a cycad. What's really cool is that these things only happen once a year or so, just like most flowering plants, but you can see how large this entire plant is. So this is a very happy plant. So as we continue around the room, you can see all these awesome, cool plants. And this plant in particular is another cycad, but you can see these super, super sharp spines on the ends of the leaves as Mark holds them. This is one of those plants that you probably wouldn't want to mess with, but dinosaurs, man, they wouldn't care at all.
Yeah, so you can imagine how tough their mouth must have been to chomp down on that. Okay, so here we have another example of a cycad, another one of those old plants that a dinosaur might have been feasting on. And you can see an example here in the center. That structure that sort of looks like a cone, that would be the reproductive structure of this plant. So you can sort of see how it resembles other gymnosperm. So despite being in the room with the cycads and the ferns, I want to point out we have a row of plants here. This right here is an orchid. But all these plants on the ground, these are an example of that houseplant we mentioned in class. Sansevieria is one of the common names for it, is an outdated scientific name for it. Now it's in the Dracaena genus. But all of these plants here are closely related, being in the same genus, and they make really great houseplants, like we were saying. They're really tough. They like low light, low water. Yeah, make for great houseplants, I think. You can see how kind of stiff they are. They kind of look almost plasticky. There's all sorts of varieties. Some are tall, some are colorful, some have stripes. And I think one of the coolest plants in this room, hopefully you can still hear me. I know that there's a fan right here, obviously we're in a greenhouse. But this right here is what I think is one of the coolest plants in this whole greenhouse. This is a Welwitschia. They're from the deserts of Africa. This is a very small one. So this right here is one leaf, and this right here is one leaf. Each leaf has been split in half. That's just kind of what this individual one happens to look like. But these plants, Welwitschia, are really, really cool. Real quick, I just want to mention, these are also a gymnosperm, non-flowering plant, but they only ever get 2 leaves. So this plant can live literally 1,000 years, and it only ever grows these 2 leaves. And they just grow perpetually, forever and ever, just keep pushing out new tissue, and the end of the leaf becomes dead and not so effective as a functional chlorophyll structure anymore. But as it grows in the desert, it becomes this big, sort of massive shrubby structure, and these dead ends of the leaves sort of wrap around it in order to protect the plant from the drying effects of the desert, of the atmosphere, losing water, and all the wind. And this plant actually makes a really good segue into the next one we're going to go to, which is the arid room. It has a lot of plants that you'd often find in the deserts of Africa or the southeast United States, and we'll be in there next. So let's move on to the arid room. So here we are in the arid room. A lot of these plants live in dry climates, like in the deserts of the southwest United States or in Africa. So a lot of these plants that you're seeing here, these sort of middle-shaped plants that are sort of radially symmetrical, these are all cactuses, technically speaking. They're in the Cactaceae family. And these are all plants you would find in the southwest United States, America. If you're in a desert in Africa, you would be seeing different plants, like what you see here. And while it might superficially resemble a cactus, these are actually quite unrelated. This is in the Euphorbiaceae family. So if you're in Africa and you see a plant that looks like a cactus, meaning it's a succulent, then that would be a plant that's more likely in the Euphorbiaceae family. And here's another example of a succulent, which is in the Crassulaceae family. It's in a third separate family. But all of these families arose independently and developed these succulent, dry weather adapted traits independently. So here we can see examples of cactuses. We'll go into more detail later in the semester. The Cactaceae family is a family we'll spend time on, and you'll be able to recognize these characteristics that are indicative of a cactus. As you can see here with the sort of radial growth and the spines. And over here, unfortunately none of the true cactuses are blooming, but what you see here, this is the other family I was talking about, the Euphorbiaceae family. And these flowers, once you get an example of what the cactus flower looks like, you can see these look quite markedly different than the other family. The Euphorbiaceae flowers and the Cactaceae flowers look quite different. So we just spoke about the cactuses and Euphorbiaceae family, about how those are both plants that arose independently in two different locations, but they can look similar and they've been adapted to similar environments. And so some of those traits that have been adapted to arid environments, as you can see here, they have thick fleshy stems or thick fleshy leaves. That's so the water, the tissue can act as a water storage mechanism in itself. So, when they have an abundance of water, they'll sort of swell up and they can store a large quantity of water in their actual tissues. These plants here, so for example, this one, it doesn't really have noticeable leaves as you might think of. A lot of these plants also have leaves that have been highly reduced or highly modified in order to also help conserve water. Another trait that these plants share that help them conserve water is they have a really thick waxy cuticle. So they have a thick waxy layer, almost like a candle, that helps protect them from losing water. So that adds a layer that prevents water from transitioning from the inside of the plant to the outside of the plant. Another thing that can help them with that same premise is like what you see here. You might not be able to see it very well, but this plant has fuzziness on the leaves. That's called pubescence. And this fuzziness on the leaf works similarly to the cactus spines, which this is not a cactus, this is unrelated, but they both have that same sort of structure that grows on the outside of the tissue in order to provide a boundary layer that, again, slows the loss of water from the inside of the plant to the outside of the plant, because it maintains a thin layer of air where it would be slightly higher humidity. Another trait that arid adapted plants, whether or not they're euphors or cactuses, all largely have would be a very extensive root system, a very pervasive root system that's really, really good at sucking up all the available water. So these root systems can often stretch far, far larger than the above ground portion of the plant you see itself. And like I said, that gives it the ability to draw up as much water as it can. So the waxy cuticle, having the structures on the outside of the plant that help reduce the moisture loss, boundary layer being the spines and the fuzziness, the extensive root system, and the reduced leaves and the different sort of structure, having big, thick, fleshy stems in order to store water. Those are all traits that arid adapted plants from different areas have all sort of come to in order to protect themselves from the same sort of driving conditions. So here we are in the tropical room. This is the last room we're going to see on the greenhouse tour today. Plants come from tropical environments like rainforest. Not necessarily all of them. What you see right here, this has the common name elephant's foot. You see it kind of looks like a giant tortoise shell. This right here is a dormant structure that persists from year to year. Here you can see the vine growing out of it. So this is a persistent structure down here. This vine will die annually and then regrow from it as it goes through its dry season. So there's all sorts of cool adaptations you see from the plants here. So another plant you'll probably find in tropical environments. Here we have even more bromeliads like we saw in the first room. You can see some of these are blooming. And then here are more. There's more bromeliad blooms. You can see the difference right here. So you can see these have not quite bloomed yet. These are blooming just now, and these down here are past blooming, and they're at this point developing fruit. And so as I mentioned previously, here you can see examples of plants that grow vertically. So some of these small leaves in the back, that is a plant that is rooted into the ground, but most of these that you're seeing here are just grown adhere to this wall. So you can see how this would be a plant that would be adapted to grow on the surface of another structure. Talking about more tropical plants, over here, this plant with the glossy foliage, this is actually an example of coffee, where you get, coffee from. One funny joke I've always heard about coffee is you can make a 3-bean soup by having coffee beans, soybeans, and I messed it up. So here we have a coffee, has these very glossy leaves, and this is where you get your coffee from, coffee beans to drink coffee. And one I think is a kind of funny joke you may have heard about coffee before is some people will say that you can make a 3-bean soup using coffee from the coffee beans and soybean milk if you're using soy milk to flavor it, and then vanilla beans if you're using vanilla to flavor it. But I think that's a little bit of a joke because none of those are actually beans. Coffee beans are not really beans. Vanilla beans, again, not really beans. And soybeans, they actually are beans. But those are things we'll go into detail later in the semester. We're going to have a whole lab dedicated to learning the different types of fruits. And we're also going to spend time specifically going to the bean family. We'll learn all about that. Another tropical plant I wanted to point out, here we have a banana. I don't even think I need to explain what a banana is. I'm sure everyone's seen a banana at the grocery store. But you can see how giant the leaves are. And this banana, I'm not sure specifically, this one could be very young, or it could be a dwarf banana. But bananas usually get quite a bit larger, like what you see with this specimen here. You can see it gets 18, 20 feet tall. And this one's actually even blooming. So if you look at the top of this floral spike that's hanging down, at the top of it, you can see developing young banana fruit. And then at the bottom of it, that's where the actual blooms are. And you can actually see those yellow blooms in there that are currently blooming. And then as they mature, they'll produce the actual banana fruit itself. So looking at this banana plant, it has a bunch of leaves at the top of this long, tall stem. A lot of people might refer to this as a tree. I'd kind of like for you guys to think to yourself for a moment, would you call this a tree if you were to come across it? Or if someone were to call this a tree, would you think that is a tree? And I want to give you a pause to let you think about that for a moment. But most people wouldn't technically consider this a tree. So this structure here, this plant that you see, once it finishes this reproductive cycle and all the blooms are spent, this big massive stem you see here will die back. These never last more than a couple years. Sometimes in a tropical environment, they can take up to 18 months to produce their fruit. But after these bloom and produce their fruit, this whole stem here that you see will die back. You can see it from over there, but there's actually a cut down stem right here. So these things don't last for that much time. Whereas a true tree generally is thought of as building up layers and layers over time, and they grow and get larger over time, which this, as I just described, doesn't do. So a lot of people would consider this not a tree, but just a very large herb. And some people, depending on how they want to characterize a tree, might call this a tree. The point I'm trying to get at is that some common terms might not be very good technical botanical terms, like tree, for example, is a kind of a bit of a vague term that you don't really hear generally used to refer to a specific thing. And I just want to use this as an example of how a plant could superficially resemble a tree, while if you dig down, you learn that it might not actually conform to a certain term. So here we have a monstera. You can see how big these leaves are. They have really massive leaves. This is one individual leaf. You can see the leaf starts here, by the way. This is all counts as part of the leaf. You can see it's as long as my arm. So you can see these plants have massive leaves. Here I want to point out another example of a bromeliad. And so the bromeliad, as I mentioned already, is an epiphyte that grows up in the canopy of trees. This monstera is a vining plant. It can grow up in the canopies of trees as an epiphyte as well. But the point I'm getting at is that both of these tropical adapted plants have adaptations to try to get themselves as close to the light as possible. The tropical rainforest can be a really shaded environment, so these giant leaves, the vining structure, and the ability to grow in the canopy itself are all adaptations that allow it to grow closer to the light. So as you can see up here, this silvery plant that's growing up on a wall, you might recognize it from like we saw in the first room. This is another example of a plant in the Bromeliaceae family, in the bromeliad family. The pineapple was the most economically significant plant that you find in that family. So these plants that you see here, not this one, these semi-spiky things here, these are another example of a bromeliad that you might find in a tropical environment. Here you can see an example of the flowers coming up. So you see they're coming up on this sort of complex inflorescence structure. This is another bromeliad flower back here. But these plants are, as I mentioned earlier, they're epiphytes. They grow up in the canopy of a tree, so they don't grow on the ground. So you see they have this structure to sort of collect their own water. So they have their own reservoir to access. And this spiky thing in here, that's the developing inflorescence. That's the developing flowers that will mature. So here we are at the opposite end of the tropical house. You can see it has this awesome water fixture here. Now this is a fountain that's actually running. This makes for a really scenic, really wonderful environment. The river still on the ground makes a really nice meditative setting. I want to point out a couple of the plants we have here. So here, floating in the water, is a plant with the common name water lettuce. So just for example, this is a plant that is a flowering plant. It's an angiosperm. Whereas here, growing on the edge of the pond, these are liverworts. This is a plant that we mentioned briefly in the plant taxonomy lecture, and we'll spend a little more time on it later in the semester. But this is a land plant that is a non-vascular plant, kind of similar to like a moss, but it's a really neat plant that is not a vascular plant, doesn't have any flowers, and like I said, we'll spend a little more time later on the semester. So here we are, back in the first room, the room that had the myrmecophytes, the ant-plant relationship plants. Here we have a lot of those epiphytes we talked about at the beginning, orchids. Here's a fern, a Spanish moss, which is in the Bromeliaceae, the bromeliad family, the pineapple family. Thanks for coming to the virtual plant tour. Sorry we weren't able to have you here in person. I hope you still got to see all the cool plants and hope you have some good questions to ask.
We hope our passion for these plants came across and you guys get to experience these plants in person at some point once COVID clears back up.
Thank you.